Let's start. So, welcome to my third installment of my examination of the current format. Um, right off the bat, I decided to do this one a little bit more differently from what I initially planned. Um, so, uh, I initially thought I would do a examination of what I did to improve my mono red list, but just recent testing sessions and talks I had with other players led me to the conclusion that maybe my assessment of that archetype wasn't 100% correct. And I'm not 100% correct either that the solution that I came up with is necessarily the correct one to approach that archetype in the current meta. So I'll need a little bit more testing and then maybe I'll come back to it at a later point. Um, but the second reason, apart from my lack of confidence in the mono red archetype, that why I decided to do this differently is because of recent conversations on the Highlander Discord and in real life and on Facebook that kind of led me to just wanting to um, examine the format in a more broader sense and maybe just a more general feel of what I think is necessary, um, not just on a deck building and playing level, but also on a mentality shift that needs to happen with some players in order to be able to compete at the top of the format and in order to facilitate positive change going forward. So, um, I will start with a few examinations about the format in general. Please be aware that this is not supposed to like insult anyone or whatever. I myself am not immune to all of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here. And I think in order to improve your your gameplay, and your deck building skills, you need to critically examine these kind of tendencies in yourself and try to find a solution for it. And that's really the point I want to make with this following few slides. So first of all, like some general thoughts that seem kind of obvious, but yeah, still bear repeating, I think, um, is that Highlander players are very conservative in their deck choices. Um, there's really not many people who switch out their decks consistently all the time, and even people who do what most Highlander players do and have their one or two pet decks that they play constantly are probably not necessarily up to speed with updating these decks to the most recent trends constantly. That might be because they might not be playing at a competitive level, but more on the kitchen table against their own decks or the decks of their friends. So they will tech against what they know, but not on a towards the meta on a more broader scale. This might be because they're kind of out of the loop in terms of the release schedule or the bannings and unbannings. Um, Maybe because they haven't played for a long time. There's multitudes of reasons why this is, but it's definitely a noticeable trend that is observable in the format, I think. Real innovation, meanwhile, only occurs in a small subset of brewers. So that means there's not that many people really trying to define new archetypes, and even among the established archetypes, it's mostly just a few archetype experts who come up with most of the innovations, I think, for that specific archetype. Um, Especially amongst the brewers who are very prolific at pioneering new archetypes, there's a common side effect of this um, frequent deck switching, and that is that most of these brews never really make it to a truly competitive level because many decks ideas are discarded before they are fully optimized and in favor for something new, or you get just bogged down into much cute stuff to really focus on what is the um, most competitive way to build that strategy. And even if you think you have found the most optimized and competitive um, version of your brew, you still have the hurdle of it being accepted in the format, because new strategies are often only accepted as viable once they um, once they have gathered a significant amount of scale tournament success. Usually, people will not accept brews that only dominate on a small scale local level. Um, Usually, um, it will have to be larger tournaments, and those obviously haven't happened that much in the past few years, although they're starting back up again now. So this large scale innovation always kind of goes on under the radar. And for a lot of players, I can see why this is definitely a point of uncertainty in this current meta, because um, what the strongest decks are is not immediately obvious to someone who only follows the larger events, because it's very difficult to conclude anything, even from the large events, but much less even from the small ones. Um, I think there's a lot more tier 1 decks or potential tier 1 decks in the format than people give credit for. And that is mostly because a lot of these decks don't really rise to the level of large scale tournament success because, well, they might only be played at smaller events, or um, just be hindered by the fact that they are only played by one or two people, and those one or two people are much less likely to win at large scale tournaments than players who play archetypes that are more common and widely spread out. On the flip side of that, we also have old archetypes that where there's no indication for why they should be um, unplayable anymore, often being declared dead simply because they haven't shown up at any at any tournaments lately. I will get to this point a little bit later on still, but decks that come to mind in this category are Scapeshift, for example, or Storm. Um, I mean, Storm was never really um, a very widely played archetype, but people were aware of its power and how competitive it could be back a few years ago. That kind of has been completely forgotten. It feels like, even though the core of the deck is still there. Um, Same also with Scapeshift. People have just mostly stopped playing Scapeshift, I think, because they got bored of it. But they got bored of it because they were winning too much, So these decks have there's no indication of why these decks shouldn't be playable, but they show up in a lot less numbers, and people seem to think they are kind of dead, even though there's nothing really to bear that out except for a lack of tournament results recently and pure conjecture due to recent changes to the format. So, this kind of conservatism obviously leads to a few trends when it comes to deck building choices, and especially choices that need to be made when um, new significant changes roll around. So, first, there's, I feel like, a general hostility towards changes to the format that threaten the status quo. So, if there's a new broken mechanic printed, like the Monarch or the Initiative, um, if there's significant bannings or unbannings that might upset the balance of established archetypes, or if there's changes to the rules, like the Mulligan rule, we often get these alarmist people complaining a lot that the format is dying. You know, why are you doing this? This is going to be the end of the Highlander format. And it's never really the case. But I think this sense stems from almost a fear of needing to adjust to the new format. Um, because people don't really like change. They want to play with their pet cards. They want to run their decks like they did when it was most successful, and change kind of upsets uh, this balance, of course. Um, Sometimes there's also an inability to make significant changes. People are too enamored with their builds to really examine them critically. There's something, you know, that is pretty obvious, I think, which is staple blindness. Um, that people develop this without noticing too much. But I think it's a very significant part of why the format is what it is. Um, there has been a long time um, where Jace the Mind Sculptor was still a regular part of tempo decks. For example, even after the tempo revolution, as I would call it, and I'll get to that later, um, as the only 4 drop in the deck, because people thought it's one of the best blue cards ever printed. Why would I ever not play this? And I think critically re-examining these staples is a trend that only happened um, kind of recently in the last few years, and has not taken hold of the entirety of the format yet. There's other staples where I think this examination is sometimes needed as well, but hasn't really fully gone through yet. And this obviously hinders uh, large scale innovation and bettering of your deck to a large degree. Another thing that can happen is a dilution of your game plan over time. And that mostly happens when you're doing or when you're reacting to those changes in the wrong way. I have included this little meme on the left here, um, mostly because of this point. Because if people run into new new mechanics or recent unbannings that they need to adjust to, the first place they go to is very narrow one of answers that might help them against that a bit of that um, uh, yeah, whatever it is really. For example, something like playing dress down against initiative and true name, which obviously is fine. Dress down is not a bad card per se. It at least cycles itself, so its inclusion isn't really a huge downside. But if you go too overboard with these narrow answers, you will inevitably get to a point where your game plan is no longer functional. And this will obviously take away percentage points from your win rate. Um, in general, I think people should sometimes be less concerned about all of the stuff that they might run into in the format. You can't consistently answer everything, and worrying too much about your opponent's nut draw will just cost you percentage point in the long run. Your goal shouldn't be to be super well equipped to everything your opponent might throw at you. The goal should be to have the best possible average win rate in whatever format you're playing in. The problem here is that there's often a lack of examination of what you could do yourself to really better your situation in a way. And that leads to people blaming the format or certain trends within the format for their inability to compete. I used to be good. Why am I not anymore? Why do I keep losing? Like, what's going on? And the important part that you need to recognize, I think, is that you will not always be good just by the virtue of being good in the past. Same as your deck. You need to make adjustments, and not just small ones, significant ones, if you start losing a lot more than you did earlier. It probably means that you or your deck is out of touch and not the rest of the format. So how would you do that? Well, you basically need to recognize that change is constant and change is often good. I kind of want to preface this point with uh, a nugget of wisdom from a recent episode of the excellent Eternal Glory podcast, um, where they said it's okay when formats shift. Yes, people will be upset, but you have to basically adjust um, to be able to compete. And the cream of the crop rises a lot because these are the players who are willing to make these changes and to compete at a higher level in the format. A good example for this, and basically the last time I've seen um, an archetype being completely redefined in the way the format looked at it, was the so-called, or what I would call the tempo revolution of 2018 and 19, where Max Hofer basically um, revolutionized the way tempo decks are built by winning both the Continental Cup and the MGM 14 back to back with his super slimmed down, very Legacy Delver esque version on Grixis Tempo. And from that time on, we haven't really seen or anything that calls itself a tempo deck running 4 drops or 30 more than like 31 lands or something, because um these yeah these these things just aren't really the face of the modern archetype anymore. um People just got wise as to how to construct the ideal tempo deck, and now they are running with it. And I think something like that is definitely possible for a lot of other archetypes as well. Um, there's just not enough, collective mind juice being invested into making it happen. Um, People might do it for their personal deck, but overall, I think a lot of what is played in the format is not really optimized to the extent it could to be at its most competitive. Um, what people like more is complaining about new mechanics, new cards, and how those cards kind of ruin the format or whatever. I have picked a choice collection of what I would call invaders from the multiplayer dimension because it's mostly cards from supplemental sets who get this kind of treatment. The usual standard fare is mostly safe from it, although some of the most broken cards in recent history have gone through standard sets as well. Um, but here's another very, very um, potent um, piece of wisdom from the Eternal Glory podcast, actually from the same episode, so go check it out. Your deck doesn't suck because of the supplemental sets, it just sucks. Um, there is always a way to adjust to these cards. Yes, mechanics like the initiative, mechanics like the monarch are inherently broken in the way they make they introduce a kind of sub game into the game where it's all about getting this non-interactable piece of value generation back on your side of the field. But overall, I think people focus too much on these broken additions that supplemental formats do put into the into the format. Um, I think overall supplemental sets are good for the actual meta. And I've included one card on here that I think people were unnecessarily afraid of, which is a good example of why um, supplemental sets ultimately have a positive impact uh, when seen in totality, which is Opposition Agent. Opposition Agent is basically just a hate bear that gave strategies that previously didn't have this like blanket answer to combo. Um, well, now a blanket answer to combo. Um, there's other examples as well. There's a lot of answers um, that came from supplemental sets that are now uh, part of the format. The pitch elementals came from supplemental sets, and people could argue that those are probably a little bit too good of answers to whatever threats your opponent might have. Um, but don't think they're so broken that they warrant a banning or anything like that. There's also something like Force of Negation, Council's Judgment, prismatic ending, a lot of like necessary and good answers to whatever new broken threats power creep throws at us comes from these supplemental sets. And just a blanket ban on all of these cards because you don't like the worst excesses of um, the supplemental sets that Wizards throws away is, I think, a little bit too much. Um, what you also need to keep in mind is that adjustment to these broken new threats is often a lot slower than the release schedule. So if you manage to find the ideal answers to these mechanics right away, or if you're an early adopter who can just show people the brokenness of initiative like months before it takes hold in legacy, then you will definitely be more successful um, with or against these strategies, at least in the earlier months where they are legal. So, just to show what is possible to, what adjustment is possible, for fighting these mechanics, we're going to have a look at what we need to do to adjust to the initiative as the newest broken mechanic. Um, and I think the most important thing here is that you need to accelerate your game plan, make your deck faster. And it's completely irrelevant what kind of archetype you're playing. Even if you're running a control deck, you can accelerate your game plan to an extent where the initiative is not as much of a problem as it is for you right now. So obviously acceleration, is a part of it is mana acceleration. Um, but that alone is not um, the be all and end all. In general, when it comes to mana cost, you can go two ways. You can either go very, very low and just operate on a level that is cheaper and faster um, than the initiative for your threats and interactions. Include a lot of free spells, play one drop, two drop, three drop, you know, build up your curve, combine that with a lot of cheap answers to your opponent's threats. So that when they drop their initiative creature on turn 3 or turn 4, you have a decent enough chance of clearing blockers and taking the initiative yourself. Um, Another way to do it is to going over the top of the initiative cards and ramping into very powerful high drops that um, can outvalue them. This obviously is a little bit more difficult, but at the end of the day, the initiative, unless you're facing White Plume on turn 2 of a Soul Land, will not be fast enough to outvalue your 5-drop Planeswalkers or your Primeval Titans and Evil Titans and Golosses and Fields of the Dead. So if you can ramp into something like that, you will definitely have a better chance at fighting these cards. Um, I think a pretty obvious one is obviously adding more creatures with evasion and haste, um, as well as going wider and adding a lot more answers to your opponent's creatures, because then once you can guarantee that your creatures will get through more often, or you'll just have more creatures than your opponent, um, it's much easier to get the initiative and hopefully defend it as well. Especially in terms of defending, blocking is a premium in this meta, and it's definitely a plus if you can run a lot of creatures that just block well, that have a lot of toughness, that have good blocking abilities like First Strike or Death Touch, stuff that doesn't that your opponent will not want to attack into, to retake the initiative. Um, Accelerating your game plan does not only mean making your game plan faster, in my book, but also making it more consistent. And to that extent, I think adding more tutors is a good way to facilitate a more consistent game plan. Because tutors can really be anything in your deck, and every color except for red has access to a decent amount of card selection by playing the tutors that are available to them. Even just playing like 4 or 5 of these will increase your consistency dramatically, because you will be able to go for certain play patterns a lot more consistently than before, even if the tutors you're running are very narrow. And that is definitely a plus to pretty much every conceivable archetype that you can possibly run. I think also it's definitely better to be more proactive than reactive. So even if you're a control deck, yes, be reactive for the first few turns, but after that, you know, go into threat mode, you know, go and pressure your opponent, ask them questions that they can't really answer. And even in the reactive elements of your game plan, I think it's um, much more advisable these days to go for proactive answers to the board and discard spells than it is to go for counter magic. Um, Even in your control deck, countering stuff is very dependent on the right timing. You know, sometimes your opponent will be able to sneak something through your counter spells, and if that happens, well, what can you really do except for answer it on the board? If you draw your counter spells late, they will be bad answers to whatever threat your opponent poses. And even in a blue deck, I don't think this is necessarily um, a good thing to do. So I think even 2 mana counter spells are getting to the point where they might be a little bit too clunky for the format. And being a little less reactive and going for more proactive answers will definitely increase your consistency, even if you're playing a control deck. Um, Another way to basically ignore the initiative or like the value game uh, in general is to go for a combo finish. To accelerate your game plan by having a quick out to the game. And there's a lot of potent 2 card combos that you can go for, even ones that rely on fairly decent cards to begin with. And in that sense, this is definitely a way to just ignore the initiative in the long run. Most importantly, though, and I can't stress this enough, you know, I've said it before, don't dilute your game plan with narrow silver bullets. There will not be a guarantee you draw these silver bullets at the right time. And I know how good it feels to draw your one off answer to whatever threat your opponent poses, but ask yourself how many games this will happen, and if that card that you just won the game with might be a liability in all of the other matchups that you're playing against. So go for the uh, go for broadly um, powerful cards and try to make your deck as good on average as it can be. Don't um, don't pay too much mind to answering specific cards. Also, and I can stress this enough, don't forget old brokenness. I have 3 examples here where I absolutely cannot understand why these are not showing up in the format right now. Tendrils of Agony as a stand-in for Storm, of course. The core of the Storm deck is still there, and I haven't seen one ever since Breach got banned. Because let's be honest, the Breach deck is just a glorified Storm deck, and the the tools to make that deck broken are still there. You don't need Breach to combo kill your opponent with a Storm kill. Breach would make things a lot easier and more consistent, but it's definitely still possible. And I think the format right now is not fast enough to outpace a well built Storm deck. You can ignore a lot of the trends in the format if you go for this, and maybe this just needs a little bit of a push to re-emerge. But yeah, like this is definitely one of the top tier decks in the format. It's just not showing up, which is kind of baffling to me. Maybe also because it requires a lot of skill to build and pilot, but that is another thing. Um, I'm not really too fond of like trying it out either, just simply because my time would probably be better spent. But if you're in any way intrigued by spell based combo, then please give this a shot. It is. I think the pieces are there, and it just requires a little bit of brewing to get going again. Some help from the ban list might also, of course, be required, but I'll come to this later on. Um, the next thing, of course, is scape shift. People are telling me that control really struggles, that control might even be dead in the format, which, yeah, like maybe it is time to re examine what control means. I definitely think that scape shift is still a very potent control deck because it doesn't need to function on the same axis as, say, blue-white control, um, since it has this potent, um, just one spell kill at the end of its game plan. So you always have a potential out to draw towards, even if your opponent takes over the game. Um, at the same time, also, I think Scapeshift does a lot of things that I outlined on the previous slide already to fight something like the initiative. Like it has an accelerated game plan by playing a lot of tutors and a lot of ramp and a lot of big powerful haymakers that will outgrind your opponent in the long game regardless. Um, and it also just plays at a level of card quality that is, yeah, that makes it kind of baffling to me why it doesn't show up in the format anymore. If you want to run Scapeshift, though, I think it's also advisable to go towards a version without counter spells. The more proactive versions of the deck definitely have seemed more potent in the recent past when I played against them. Um, because for any kind of aggressive deck, having your opponent stranded with counter spells while you're beating them down is definitely yeah, a good path to victory. And I think counter spells need to be almost excluded out of these reactive control decks to make them function uh, in a way that is concurrent with the current format. Um, yeah, another very potent card, and this is one both for combo and for control, is Oath of Druids. This is probably the most broken card in the current format, and no one is playing it. Come on. Like, seriously, there's so many creature decks running around. Even the combo decks these days are creatures. There's absolutely no reason why Oath of Druids should be relegated to the dustbin of the format. This is probably the most underused card in the entire format, considering what insane power level it has. Both as an early just threat generating machine for control decks, as well as a potent combo piece for stuff like Reanimator, but also for spell based combo like Storm. So, yeah, what I want to say is, ironically, because like obviously these creature decks are, um, my bread and butter kind of. I want to see more Oath in the format. All right. Apart from these, well, old forgotten goodies, there's also a lot of new contenders showing up in the format that people haven't really realized the potential of, I think. And those are the creature combo decks. Um, there's definitely a lot of potential here. We've seen recent wins by Kikipot and Pattern Rector, but also Goblins. As memey as it sounds, the Goblin deck is very, very potent, as it has a pretty solid aggro slash mid range game plan, topped off by a potential turn 3 combo kill. So yeah, don't sleep on these decks. And also don't sleep on Allurin, which is probably the most annoying combo strategy I've ever played against. Um, and a potential contender for one of the most broken decks that the current format has to offer. So yeah, these are definitely potential top tier contenders that you need to prepare for in the coming meta. All of them obviously accelerated by Birthing Pod, which will be um, one of the cornerstones of the format going forward, and you have to prepare for that. That's for sure. Of course, though, there's a little bit of a problem with spell-based combo, as I already said when I was talking about Storm. And some people have been suggesting unbanning something like Academy, for example, to make up for this lack of spell-based combo. Um, However, I also said earlier that I think spell-based combo is already very possible in the current format. There's a lot of good playable tools already available, and it might just need a little bit of a push to re-emerge in the format. I want to highlight the importance of incentivizing brewing as well, um, and not overpowering the format with something that that the format might just not be equipped to right now. So unbanning something like Oracle or Breach or Academy would be a little bit too on the nose. Like, just saying, oh, well, look at this. Here's this massively broken degenerate combo piece. Just go nuts. You know what to do. You know. Um, what I'd like to see is an unbanning of more broad, more, just generic good combo cards like Mystical Tutor, like Gifts and Given, like Sensei's Divining Top. Maybe even Vampiric Tutor, but I'm much, much, much less, um, much less fond of that one because it could facilitate a lot of very, very degenerate brokenness all by itself, of course. So, yeah, but I think these three cards are definitely fine. Um, and maybe good enough to, you know, push a spell-based combo into a more playable, more mainstream, um, you know, center of the format again. And speaking of banned cards, I want to end this with a little bit of a controversial topic. Um, Library of Alexandria. Is this just the weakest card on the ban list? And why is it still on there? Um, this card seems like a relic of a bygone era, that is just not up to speed with modern day Magic. Why am I saying that? Well, it's only good in your opening hand, and it's an awful top deck. Um, it's only really good on the draw because I guess playing it turn one on the play is fine, and then you skip your turn two. Uh, you see what I mean? Like it slows down your own game plan to draw extra cards from turn one onward, which just seems absolutely awful in today's board centric modern day meta, with just where everything is like accelerating out the initiative or playing turn one Ragavans or whatever. you just can't spend your first few turns just drawing extra cards. Um, well, maybe we have to examine why it's on the ban list in the first place. The last time this was unbanned was in the late 2000s. I think it was unbanned in late 2008 and banned again in early 2010, which meant it was legal for about a year. And the reason why it was banned again was mostly threefold. First, it was a concern that it might be too polarizing and frustrating to lose the game to something, to just a lucky draw by your opponent on the first turn, which seems kind of ridiculous that that was a concern 13 years ago, because like that's just Magic in a nutshell today. Um, the second is that it was prohibitively expensive, and in that regard, um, you know, oh well, uh, it was prohibitively expensive and at the same time recognized as something you needed for the ideal build of a control deck. Um, so people were concerned about the accessibility of the card to the format and to control as an archetype in general, which actually today seems kind of like a plus in actuality, because like the insane price tag will, if anything, keep it in check if it's too broken. There's other cards in the format that are just as expensive that see no or close to no play, even though they might be like pretty broken, because they're just too expensive for that. And even considering the standards of the time, it seemed pretty hypocritical to ban this while Tabernacle, which is similarly expensive, and also probably an include in the most ideal control list, was still remaining legal. So, what gives? I don't know. Um, but yeah, like the third thing, obviously, that is important here is that this is a control card through and through. And if this helps any archetype, then it's definitely control, which is struggling right now. And do I think that this card will make it better? Not necessarily, because as I outlined, it seems like modern day design just has passed this by. Um, but it's worth a shot, I think. It's definitely not deserving on a slot of on the ban list. So yeah, unbanning it is just a no-brainer in my assessment. But yeah, maybe tell me what you think about this card. I definitely think it's not worth a slot on the ban list. Um, but yeah, like this is my assessment of what the current format is. What you need to do to adjust to it, and what you need to consider, with like future embeddings and unbeddings, maybe. Hint, hint. Um, please unban a whole bunch of cards. Yeah, so much for now. Next video will maybe be coming up soon. I don't know. Um, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed this series so far. Sorry for all the ums and ahs and pauses. These videos are not really scripted. They can run a little bit too long, maybe as well. I will try my best in the future to adjust to this a little bit more. Um, but yeah, I'm just doing this for fun, so I hope I can entertain you a little bit as well, and maybe give you an idea of my ideas on the format and what I think is necessary to play as best as you can.